Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois. We are finishing up the final chapter. This chapter is entitled The Sorrow Songs. This is chapter 14. After we finish this reading up and finish this episode up, the next episode will be a recap of the book as a whole, and then we will move on to our next book on our curriculum, which is Evicted by Matthew Desmond. Chapter 14, The Sorrow Songs. I will walk through the churchyard to lay this body down. I know moonrise, I know starrise. I walk in the moonlight, I walk in the starlight. I'll lie in the grave and stretch out my arms. I'll go to judgment in the evening of the day, and my soul and thy soul shall meet that day when I lay this body down. Negro song. They that walked in darkness sang songs in the olden days, sorrow songs, for they were weary at heart. And so before each thought that I have written in this book, I have said a phrase, a haunting echo of these weird old songs in which the soul of the black slave spoke to men. Ever since I was a child, these songs have stirred me strangely. They came out of the South unknown to me, one by one, and yet at once I knew them as of me and of mine. Then in after years when I came to Nashville, I saw the great temple builded of these songs towering over the pale city. To me, Jubilee Hall seemed ever made of the songs themselves, and its bricks were red with blood and dust of toil. Out of them rose for me morning, noon, and night, bursts of wonderful melody, full of the voices of my brothers and sisters, full of the voices of the past. Little of beauty has America given the world save the rude grandeur God himself stamped on her bosom. The human spirit in this new world has expressed itself in vigor and ingenuity rather than in beauty. And so by fateful chance, the Negro folk song, the rhythmic cry of the slave, stands today not simply as the sole American music, but as the most beautiful expression of human experience born this side of the seas. It has been neglected, it has been, and is, half despised, and above all, it has been persistently mistaken and misunderstood. But notwithstanding, it still remains as the singular spiritual heritage of the nation and the greatest gift of the Negro people. Away back in the 30s, the melody of these slave songs stirred the nation, but the songs were soon half forgotten. Some, like, quote, near the lake where dropped the willow, end quote, passed into current airs, and their source was forgotten. Others were caricatured on the, quote, minstrel, end quote, stage, and their memory died away. Then in wartime came the singular Port Royal experiment after the capture of Hilton Head, and perhaps for the first time the North met the Southern slave face to face and heart to heart with no third witness. The sea islands of the Carolinas, where they met, were filled with the black folk of primitive type, touched and molded less by the world about them than any others outside the Black Belt. Their appearance was uncouth, their language funny, but their hearts were human and their singing stirred men with a mighty power. Thomas Wentworth Higginson hastened to tell of these songs, and Miss McKim and others urged upon the world their rare beauty. But the world listened only half credulously until the Fisk Jubilee singers sang the slave songs so deeply into the world's heart that it can never wholly forget them again. There was once a blacksmith's son born at Cadiz, New York, who in the changes of time taught school in Ohio and helped defend Cincinnati from Kirby Smith. Then he fought at Chancellorsville and Gettysburg and finally served in the Freedmen's Bureau at Nashville. Here he formed a Sunday school class of black children in 1866 and sang with them and taught them to sing. And then they taught him to sing. And when once the glory of the Jubilee songs passed into the soul of George L. White, he knew his life work was to let those Negroes sing to the world as they had sung to him. So in 1871, the pilgrimage of the Fisk Jubilee singers began. North to Cincinnati they rode, 4 half-clothed black boys and 5 girl women, led by a man with a cause and a purpose. They stopped at Wilberforce, the oldest of Negro schools, where a black bishop blessed them. Then they went, fighting cold and starvation, shut out of hotels and cheerfully sneered at, ever northward. And ever the magic of their song kept thrilling hearts until a burst of applause in the Congregational Council at Oberlin revealed them to the world. They came to New York, and Henry Ward Beecher dared to welcome them even though the Metropolitan Daily sneered at his, quote, nigger minstrels, end quote. So their songs conquered till they sang across the land and across the sea, before Queen and Kaiser, in Scotland and Ireland, Holland and Switzerland. 7 years they sang and brought back $150,000 to found Fisk University. Since their day, they have been imitated, sometimes well, by the singers of Hampton and Atlanta, sometimes ill, by straggling quartets. Caricature has sought again to spoil the quaint beauty of the music and has filled the air with many debased melodies which vulgar ears scarce know from the real. But the true Negro folk song still lives in the hearts of those who have heard them truly sung and in the hearts of the Negro people. What are these songs, and what do they mean? I know little of music and can say nothing in technical phrase, but I know something of men, and knowing them, I know that these songs are the articulate message of the slave to the world. They tell us in these eager days that life was joyous to the black slave, careless and happy. I can easily believe this of some, of many. But not all the past South, though it rose from the dead, can gainsay the heart-touching witness of these songs. They are the music of an unhappy people, of the children of disappointment. They tell of death and suffering and unvoiced longing toward a truer world, of misty wanderings and hidden ways. So let's have a reflection. What stands out to me from the passages that we just read is, and this is one of the things that I pointed out, I said that this whole book was really a tragedy and that the history of black people in this country is a history of tragedy. And these songs exemplify that tragedy. These songs give music to that tragedy. One of the things that people often say in music circles is, or it's not really a saying, but a belief in music circles is that the best music comes from pain. I watched the movie The Temptations, and one of the singers, one of the writers of the part of the group of The Temptations, won an award. And when he went up after he won the award, he said that people told him he would be a great writer one day once he experienced more pain. And then he thanked some people in his life who contributed to him experiencing more pain. So it was a little bit of shade there. But that has always stuck with me as somebody who writes music, as somebody who's a fan of music, as somebody who creates, records music. That notion of experiencing pain leads to to a deeper kind of creation of music, or even a deeper creation of art, is something that I've always had a belief in. And when you think about the type of pain that black people as a nation have, and that's what we are. We exist as a nation within this country. Black people as a nation have, as a people, as a community, have dealt with in this country. It's not surprising that they have been able to create the type of art, the type of music that they have been able to. But on the side of that, I think what's important to point out is that in these songs, there was also a sense of struggle, that the even just the creation of music when you are in such dire circumstances as slavery, such dire circumstances as sharecropping, as Jim Crow, as eventually when Martin Luther King Jr. would, and the civil rights movement would emerge in the late 50s and in the 60s. One of the things that would be integral to the civil rights movement would be freedom songs, and a lot of these freedom songs were adaptations of songs from slavery, and so there's a fight back, there's a struggle that exists within that. Some of these songs would explain to you when they were, or would have messages about when they were going to be running away from a plantation, or what way they were going to go on the plantation, or it just would be singing about at some point getting running away from a plantation. None of these songs were ever about being happy to be in America, or being content with their status and being in America, or about becoming rich, or about becoming famous. You know, these things were about were about survival, were about freedom, were about liberty, independence. And when you fast forward and you look at the musical tradition that exists today, one of the reasons that black music today is missing so many of those aspects is because it has been bought and sold by white people, because it has been bought and sold by white mass media, by white record companies, by white record label executives. And so many things that are part of black culture, once black people accepted the token integrationism that was proposed to them through the 50s and the 60s, 70s, and the 80s in an effort to uh, appease black people. One of the things that happened is that also brought parts of black culture that were unique to us into the mainstream. And instead of being able to hold on to it when it went to the mainstream, again, it was sold and bought, and white people, white supremacy was able to profit off of it. And I think that legacy, that history of black music is very important. W.E.B. Du Bois said within here that he said that the slave songs were the black people's greatest contribution to the nation, and I think that I disagree with that. I think that the greatest contribution that black people have brought to this nation is the struggle for equality, the struggle for justice, the struggle for freedom. We have been on the forefront at the front of the line at during every struggle that has taken place for justice and freedom and equality in this country. And there are multiple groups of people who can thank some of the gains that they have made specifically to the sacrifices of black people in this country. The songs are indeed the siftings of centuries. The music is far more ancient than the words, and in it we can trace here and there signs of development. My grandfather's grandmother was seized by an evil Dutch trader 2 centuries ago, and coming to the valleys of the Hudson and the Housatonic. Okay. My grandfather's grandmother was seized by an evil Dutch trader 2 centuries ago, and coming to the valleys of the Hudson and Housatonic, black, little, and lithe, she shivered and shrank in the harsh north winds, looked longingly at the hills, and often crooned a heathen melody to the child between her knees. And then it has some music in the next paragraphs, but the music is in a different language, and I'm not gonna butcher it, so I'm gonna skip over that. Excuse me, sorry about the yawning. I've been doing a little bit of yawning on this episode. I might have done it a little bit on the last episode too. Recording these at night, actually recording these on July 5th, the morning after the racist white nationalist July 4th celebration this country put on. We begun the book on Juneteenth, finished it on 4th of July. The child sang it to his children, and they to their children's children. And so 200 years it has traveled down to us, and we sing it to our children, knowing as little as our fathers what its words may mean, but knowing well the meaning of its music. This was primitive African music. It may be seen in larger form in the strange chant which heralds, quote, the coming of John, end quote. You may bury me in the east, you may bury me in the west, but I'll hear the trumpet sound in that morning. The voice of exile. 10 master songs, more or less, one may pluck from this forest of melody. Songs of undoubted Negro origin and wide popular currency, and songs peculiarly characteristic of the slave. One of these I have just mentioned. Another whose strain begins this book is, quote, nobody knows the trouble I've seen, end quote. When struck with the Southern poverty, the United States refused to fulfill its promises of land to the freedmen. A brigadier general went down to the Sea Islands to carry the news. An old woman on the outskirts of the throng began singing this song. All the mass joined with her, swaying, and the soldier wept. The third song is the cradle song of death, which all men know. Quote, swing low, sweet chariot, end quote, whose bars begin the life story of, quote, Alexander Crummell, end quote. Then there is the song of many waters, quote, roll, Jordan, roll, end quote, a mighty chorus with minor cadences. There were many songs of the fugitive, like that which opens, quote, "The Wings of Atlanta," end quote, and the more familiar, quote, "Been a Listening," end quote. The seventh is the song of the end and the beginning, quote, "My Lord, what a morning when the stars begin to fall," end quote. A strain of this is placed before, quote, "The dawn of freedom," end quote. The song of groping, quote, "My way's cloudy," end quote, begins, quote, "The meaning of progress," end quote. The ninth is the song of this chapter, quote, "Wrestling Jacob, the day is a breaking," end quote, a poem of hopeful strife. The last master song is the Song of Songs, quote, "Still away," end quote, sprung from, quote, "The faith of our fathers," end quote. There are many others of the Negro folk songs as striking and characteristic as these, as, for instance, the three strains in the third, eighth, and ninth chapters, and others I am sure could easily make a selection on more scientific principles. There are, too, songs that seem to me a step removed from the more primitive types. There is the Maze Light medley, quote, "Bright sparkles," end quote, one phrase of which heeds, quote, "the black belt," end quote. The Easter Carol, quote, "Dust, dust, and ashes," end quote. The dirge, quote, "My mother's took her flight and going home," end quote. And that burst of melody hovering over, quote, "the passing of the firstborn," end quote. Quote, "I hope my mother will be there in that beautiful world on high," end quote. These represent a third step in the development of the slave song, of which, quote, "You may bury me in the East," end quote, is the first, and songs like, quote, "March On," end quote, in chapter 6, and, quote, "Still Away," end quote, are the second. The first is African music, the second Afro-American, while the third is a blending of Negro music with the music heard in the foster land. The result is still distinctively Negro and the method of blending original, but the elements are both Negro and Caucasian. One might go further and find a fourth step in this development, where the songs of white America have been distinctively influenced by the slave songs or have incorporated whole phrases of Negro melody as, quote, "Swant's River," end quote, and, quote, "Old Black Joe," end quote. Side by side, too, with the growth has gone the debasements and imitations. The Negro, quote, minstrel, end quote, songs, many of the, quote, gospel, end quote, hymns, and some of the contemporary, quote, coon, end quote, songs. A mass of music in which the novice may easily lose himself and never find the real Negro melodies. So what stands out to me about the passage we just read there is, like I was just pointing out to you about the history of the exploitation of black music when it comes to some white record labels and white record executives. There has also been a constant exploitation of black music by other artists, by white artists. When you think about Elvis, and they just put an Elvis movie out, and Elvis was historically known for stealing black music. And when you think about a litany list of white musicians who were singing lyrics that were written by black people or songs that are originally recorded by black people, and it was because these people were black, they were not given the opportunity to sing these songs and excuse me, and perform these songs. And even the ones who were given the opportunities were not given the same opportunity as white people were. They weren't allowed to go and have amass the same type of audience as white people were. And so we just see in the early stages, this is in the 1905, remember that this book came out. So this is the early stages of musical exploitation. It would balloon much further once capitalism became so intertwined with the creation of music. In these songs, I have said, the slave spoke to the world. Such a message is naturally veiled and half articulate. Words and music have lost each other, and new and cant phrases of dimly understood theology have displaced the older sentiment. Once in a while, we catch a strange word of an unknown tongue, as the, quote, "mighty Mayo," end quote, which figures as a river of death. More often, slight words or mere doggerel are joined to music of singular sweetness. Purely secular songs are few in number, partly because many of them were turned into hymns by a change of words, partly because the frolics were seldom heard by the stranger, and the music less often caught. Of nearly all the songs, however, the music is distinctly sorrowful. The 10 master songs I have mentioned tell in words and music of trouble and exile, of strife and hiding. They grope towards some unseen power and sigh for the rest in the end. And sigh, excuse me. They grope towards some unseen power and sigh for rest in the end. The words that are left to us are not without interest and cleared of evident dross. They conceal much of real poetry and meaning beneath conventional theology and unmeaning rhapsody. Like all primitive folk, the slaves stood near to nature's heart. Life was a, quote, rough and rolling sea, end quote, like the brown Atlantic of the Sea Islands. The, quote, wilderness, end quote, was the home of God, and the, quote, lonesome valley, end quote, led to the way of life. Quote, winter will soon be over, end quote, was the picture of life and death to a tropical imagination. The sudden wild thunderstorms of the South awed and impressed the Negroes. At times, the rumbling seemed to them, quote, mournful, end quote, at times imperious. Quote, my Lord calls me. He calls me by the thunder. The trumpet sounds it in my soul, end quote. The monotonous toil and exposure is painted in many words. One sees the plowman in the hot, moist furrow, singing, quote, there's no rain to wet you, there's no sun to burn you. Oh, push along, believer, I want to go home, end quote. The bowed and bent old man cries, with thrice repeated wail, quote, oh Lord, keep me from sinking down, end quote. And he rebukes the devil of doubt who can whisper, quote, Jesus is dead and God's gone away, end quote. Yet the soul hunger is there, the restlessness of the savage, the wail of the wanderer, and the plaint is put in one little phrase. My soul wants some things that's new. Over the inner thoughts of the slaves and their relations one with another, the shadow of fear ever hung, so that we get but glimpses here and there, and also with them eloquent omissions and silences. Mother and child are sung, but seldom father. Fugitive and weary wanderer call for pity and affection, but there is little of wooing and wedding. The rocks and the mountains are well known, but home is unknown. Strange blending of love and helplessness sings through the refrain. Yonder is my old mother, been wagging at the hill so long, 'bout time she cross over, get home by and by. Elsewhere comes the cry of the, quote, motherless, end quote, and the, quote, farewell, farewell, my only child, end quote. Love songs are scarce and fall into two categories, the frivolous and light, and the sad. Of deep, successful love, there is ominous silence, and in one of the oldest of these songs, there is a depth of history and meaning. Poor Rosie, poor gal, poor Rosie, poor gal. Rosie, break my poor heart. Heaven shall be my home. A black woman said of the song, quote, it can't be sung without a full heart and a troubled spirit, end quote. The same voice sings here that sings in the German folk song. And then there's something in German that I can't read. Of death, the Negro showed little fear, but talked of it familiarly. Of death, the Negro showed little fear, but talked of it familiarly and even fondly as simply a crossing of the waters. Perhaps, who knows? Back to his ancient forest again. Later days transfigured his fatalism, and amid the dust and dirt the toiler sang, dust, dust, and ashes fly over my grave, but the Lord shall bear my spirit home. The things evidently borrowed from the surrounding world undergo characteristic change when they enter the mouth of the slave. Especially is this true of Bible phrases. Quote, weep, O captive daughter of Zion, end quote, is quaintly turned into, quote, Zion, weep alow, end quote. And the wheels of Ezekiel are turned every way in the mystic dreaming of the slave, till he says, there's a little wheel a turning in my heart. As in olden time, The words of these hymns were improvised by some leading minstrel of the religious band. The circumstances of the gathering, however, the rhythm of the songs, and the limitations of allowable thought confined the poetry for the most part to single or double lines, and they seldom were expanded to quatrains or longer tales, although there are some few examples of sustained efforts, chiefly paraphrases of the Bible. 3 short series of verses have always attracted me. A little audio thing there. Is our batteries dying? Shouldn't be. These new batteries. Let's keep going. 3 short series of verses have always attracted me. The one that heads this chapter, of the line of which Thomas Wentworth Higginson has fittingly said, quote, "Never, it seems to me, since man first lived and suffered, was his infinite longing for peace uttered more plaintively," end quote. The second and third are descriptions of the Last Judgment, the one a late improvisation with some traces of outside influence. Quote, "Oh, the stars and the elements are falling, and the moon drips away into blood, and the ransomed of the Lord are returning to God. Blessed be the name of the Lord," end quote. And the other earlier and homelier picture from the low coast lands, quote, "Michael hauled the boat ashore, then you'll hear the horn they blow. Then you'll hear the trumpet sound the world around. Trumpet sound for rich and poor. Trumpet sound the Jubilee. Trumpet sound for you and me," end quote. Through all the sorrow of the sorrow songs, there breathes a hope, a faith in the ultimate justice of things. The minor cadences of despair change often to triumph and calm confidence. Sometimes it is faith in life, sometimes a faith in death, sometimes assurance of boundless justice in some fair world beyond. But whichever it is, the meaning is always clear, that sometime, somewhere, men will judge men by their souls and not by their skins. Is such a hope justified? Do the sorrow songs sing true? The silently growing assumption of this age is that sorry about that. The silently growing assumption of this age is that the probation of races is past, and that the backward races of today are of proven inefficiency and not worth the saving. Such an assumption is the arrogance of peoples irreverent toward time and ignorant of the deeds of men. 1,000 years ago, such an assumption easily possible would have made it difficult for the Tuatan to prove his right to life. 2,000 years ago, such dogmatism, readily welcome, would have scouted the idea of blind races ever leading civilization. So woefully unorganized is the sociological knowledge that the meaning of progress, the meaning of, quote, swift, end quote, and, quote, slow, end quote, in human doing, and the limits of human perfectibility are veiled, unanswered sphinxes on the shores of science. Why should Aeschylus have sung 2,000 years before Shakespeare was born? Why has civilization flourished in Europe and flickered, flamed, and died in Africa? So long as the world stands meekly dumb before such questions, shall this nation proclaim its ignorance and unhallowed prejudices by denying freedom of opportunity to those who brought the sorrow songs to the seats of the mighty. Your country? How came it yours? Before the pilgrims landed, we were here. Here we have brought our 3 gifts and mingled them with yours. A gift of story and song, soft, stirring melody, in an ill-harmonized and unmelodious land. The gift of sweet and brawn to beat back the wilderness, conquer the soil, and lay the foundations of this vast economic empire 200 years earlier than your weak hands could have done it. The third, a gift of the spirit. Around us, the history of the land has centered for thrice 100 years. Out of the nation's heart, we have called all that was best to throttle and subdue all that was worst. Fire and blood, prayer and sacrifice have billowed over this people, and they have found peace only in the altars of the God of right. Nor has our gift of the Spirit been merely passive. Actively, we have woven ourselves with the very warp and woof of this nation. We fought their battles, shared their sorrow, mingled our blood with theirs, and generation after generation have pleaded with the headstrong, careless people to despise not justice, mercy, and truth, lest the nation be smitten with the curse. Our song, our toil, our cheer, and warning have been given to this nation in blood brotherhood. Are not these gifts worth the giving? Is not this work and striving? Would America have been America without her Negro people? Even so is the hope that sang in the songs of my fathers well sung. If somewhere in this world and chaos of things there dwells eternal good, pitiful yet masterful, then anon in his good time America shall rend the veil, and the prison shall go free. Free, free as the sunshine trickling down the morning into these high windows of mine. Free as yonder fresh young voices welling up to me from the caverns of brick and mortar below, swelling with song, instinct with life, tremulous treble and darkening bass. My children, my little children, are sinking to the sunshine, and thus they sing. Let us cheer the weary Let us cheer the weary traveler. Cheer the weary traveler. Let us cheer the weary traveler along the heavenly way. And the traveler girds himself and sets his face toward the morning and goes his way. And then we got a very short afterthought here we'll read, and then we'll end this episode, and I'll do a review on the next episode. I won't do any recap of the last passages. The afterthought. Hear my cry, O God the reader. Vouchsafe that this book fall not stillborn into the world wilderness. Let there spring, gentle one, from out its leaves vigor of thought and thoughtful deed to reap the harvest wonderful. Let the ears of a guilty people tingle with truth, and 70 million sigh for the righteousness which exalteth nations. In this drear day, when human brotherhood is mockery and a snare. Thus in thy good time may infinite reason turn the tangle straight, and these crooked marks on a fragile leaf be not indeed. The end.